Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, April 10th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, a new look at why the Washington region continues to lag on job recovery and what that reality means for communities and careers tied to federal work. But before we turn to pressures closer to home, a stop in Houston, where NASA's Artemis II mission is putting years of federal preparation to the test in real time. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. One of Ed Forst's first priorities as GSA administrator has been finishing what's been years in the making. In his first 100 days on the job, Forst moved to implement transactional data reporting across all multiple award schedule contracts. To explain what that expansion means for agencies and vendors, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, joins me now. Jason, good to have you.
Thanks, Terry.
Feels like the first order question is, what exactly is transactional data reporting?
Terry, I'm going to nerd out on us a little bit when it comes to acquisition. You know I do enjoy a good acquisition discussion, but TDR is replacing something called the price reduction clause, otherwise known as the PRC. Now, this is a requirement that has been in every schedule for vendors since the time before time, right? Since the schedules were developed back in the 90s. And really what it did is it required vendors to give the government their lowest price no matter what. So this basically means if a vendor sells one widget for $1 to agency X and they sell that same widget to a commercial company for 75 cents, well, then they have to tell the agency that they reduced their costs and then reduce their costs going forward. Now, vendors generally dislike the PRC because it was burdensome, a lot of the requirements around it, and it also gave them a huge risk around False Claims Act violations. Now, Laura Stanton is the Deputy Commissioner of GSA's Federal Acquisition Service. At the recent Coalition for Common Sense in Government Procurement Conference last January, Stanton says the move to TDR is all about the type of data the government is asking for now.
Instead of just giving us quarterly sales reporting of the industrial funding fee, we're asking for monthly reports with a series of data elements that give us better insight into who's buying what and what was paid at the point of sale, as opposed to just the ceiling price that we have on schedule. And so what type of discounts are the customers able to negotiate?
Jason, what steps has GSA taken to actually bring TDR closer to the finish line?
So two big things happened over the last couple of months. Now, first, I heard from a GSA spokesperson. I sent them a bunch of questions around TDR, and they got back to me by email. And they said they made TDR mandatory back in 2025 for all existing product special item numbers, otherwise known as SINs, and select SINs in the services world like cloud computing. Now, GSA says this anticipated a change brought in about 2,600 more product contracts under TDR. Then this past March, they announced the full implementation of the transactional data reporting requirements for approximately 101 other SINs. This will complete the expansion across all multiple award contracts. Under Math's Refresh 31, if you're keeping score at home, Terry, which GSA actually will issue later this month, they gave us a little bit of a preview last month. It will tell vendors how to expand TDR across all those SINs starting July 1st. Now, I talked to several experts, and they say July 1st may be a little aggressive, but this is moving toward that full implementation, and it's really starting to happen. Again, the GSA spokesperson says to me, the agency recommends that any non-TDR offers not yet submitted should begin transitioning to TDR in that format in preparation for submission. So basically telling vendors, get ready, it's coming, don't waste time.
Once it's fully implemented, how will TDR benefit both agencies and vendors?
Let's start with some hard numbers. Going back to GSA Administrator Forst, he says by implementing TDR, agencies and industry could save as much as $50 million. Now, this is in a couple ways. First, it's reducing the burden of the price reduction clause. And more importantly, it's by getting more consistent prices for agencies for products and services from the schedule. So a lot of this could be cost avoidance, not necessarily hard savings. But the point is, agencies and vendors will have a better idea of what they're buying, what they're selling, and the price around it. More specifically, GSA Stanton says TDR will help contracting officers buy better and vendors sell better.
This is really to be able to get that level of data and be able to say, we want to be able to do a better job of our really negotiating, looking at the prices paid, being for supply chain risk management, also being able to identify when somebody's bought an item that proves to provide risk to the federal government and be able to identify that. I talked about catalog curation. This data gives us the ability to tell you what's actually being bought by the federal government and what the value and what's useful for you to be putting within your own catalogs.
GSA says there's something like tens of millions of products under the catalog, and there's just not everyone buys everything off the catalog. Using this data, they'll be able to understand a little bit better. And in fact, they've already started to see that. Now, Jeff Lau is the Assistant Commissioner for the Office of General Supplies and Services at FAS and GSA. He says 82% of their contracts already are taking in TDR data.
There's some power in that data. I think early iterations when we were testing it was in office supply space, going years back, and it was messy. When Laura, go back to the comment about what are our agency stakeholders, partners actually buying, we use TDR to actually find that data. So the 100 million items, we actually use that data to see, even if it's one transaction for one unique part number, we were able to use TDR data to isolate and say, hey, someone's actually buying this. There's a reason to have that, and it goes a full spectrum. So it becomes a really powerful tool as we look to combine spend, possibly consolidate spend across government for unique products and services. That's what we're starting to do.
Now, Larry Hale, the Assistant Commissioner of the IT category, also at FAS at GSA, added they've applied TDR to technology hardware space, and now they're looking to expand it to the IT services space.
As we move forward with TDR across the full multiple award schedule, again, it's the data. It's our ability to process data and learn from data and use data today is so much better than it was when the TDR pilot started. So we're actually really excited about the opportunity of what we can learn, that curated catalog, understanding what the demand signals are and what the actual price is being paid across the entire multiple award schedule.
Now, for vendors, Terry, it goes even beyond this, right? Obviously, they're going to lower their risk about being caught up in a False Claims Act case. GSA says TDR also requires less administrative effort compared to traditional contracts, and the program will make it easier for small businesses to participate in the multiple award schedules program. Additionally, GSA says industry has told them that participating in TDR saves them about 22 hours per year per contract over the legacy reporting model. GSA added that they know with other process improvements and alignment with the commercial practices, that number will likely be significantly higher, meaning they'll be able to save more and more hours over time.
Jason, the promise here sounds great, but are there folks who maybe aren't on board with TDR? What concerns might some folks have?
This has been something that's, I would say, controversial over the last decade, but people have kind of run hot and cold, a lot of concerns about it. Most of those concerns have been coming from GSA's Inspector General. They put out, something like 6 or 8 reports over the last decade expressing real, hey, this is not doing what we think it should be doing. The concerns they've raised are ranging from data quality issues to the actually if contracting officers are using the data. And then, of course, price variability is also a big concern. Now, despite these disagreements with the IG, GSA has pressed forward with full implementation of TDR. Now, of course, I asked GSA about the IG. Their response to me was very politically nice. They appreciate the insights provided by the IG. And when the IG has identified areas of improvement, GSA says they will continue to use that information to improve the use of TDR. Terry, I took it one step further and talked to Irv Kaler, who's a principal at Curve Services, former assistant commissioner for General Supplies and Services. And for the most part, he says GSA has fixed many of those initial challenges with TDR that the IG highlighted. He says, the IG has probably been more aggressive, and maybe he called it a little clickbaity with the headlines around TDR that you've seen in the reports. But at the same time, they haven't necessarily been wrong either. There have been some problems with the TDR data on the front end. And again, GSA has done, he says, a nice job of addressing the quality issues around the data and the fact that the contracting officers maybe were not using the TDR data and tools like they should. He says GSA still does need to do more to address IG concerns around price variability. Now, Kaler is a big supporter of TDR and believes TDR will help agencies, industry, GSA really benefit from the full implementation. But there are some major challenges ahead, and he outlined them around 3 big areas. First of all, getting to a standard for products that are configurable. Think about furniture, right? Is it a chair? Does it leather? Is it vinyl? Like those different configurations of furniture can be difficult to price. Things bought through labor hours. Again, cloud computing services is a good example. And finally, commodity services, again, around IT specifically. What Kaler says is GSA and industry really have to agree to a common definition, and that is not going to be easy, and that will take some time. Services, even more difficult, and he uses this example. Trying to normalize the price you pay for a person, say, in an aerospace industry with a master's degree that has 10 years of experience. How to really normalize that price? They should be paid between X and Y. Well, what is X and Y, and how do you get agencies not to always go for the lower end of the spectrum? How do you really make a fair price? Because, of course, Terry, the vendor wants the higher end of the spectrum. But he says, listen, getting to these standards are doable. It'll just take a lot of time and effort. And this tags all the way back to that July 1 goal from GSA, that deadline to get this going. He believes this is why maybe it will take a little longer than folks think.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, it sounds like in GAO's famous phrase, progress has been made, much remains to be done.
I think a lot of progress has been made. I think that's fair. But again, yes, more to come this summer.
You can find Jason's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, Artemis II is showing how federal education and operational experience come together in space. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Several Artemis II team members bring military and academic backgrounds that reflect a long-term federal investment in advanced education. Observers say the mission highlights how institutions like the Naval Postgraduate School translate classroom learning into real-world mission execution. Joining us from Mission Control in Houston is science writer with the Naval Postgraduate School, Dan Linehan. Dan, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thank you for having me along, Terry.
We have all been marveling at the pictures that are coming back from the Artemis crew on their journey around the moon, and they're due to splash down tonight. But before we get to that, I want you to help us put the mission in context. What really was NASA trying to prove or learn with this flight?
Yeah, and views expressed here are my own. I'm doing this in my capacity as a career-long science writer. I think there's multiple things that they did. They have a science mission, but they also have a flight test mission. And so this is the first time that this launch system has been used with humans. It's the first time the capsule's been used with humans. And these are all new instruments. These are all new procedures that this crew of four is having to now execute. They've trained really, really hard for this. They've trained, for years, and now they're trying to execute. But the reality is they're now in space, and space is a lot different than, in simulators, on Earth.
You've been sitting there at Mission Control in Houston. What have you seen?
Well, I tell you, it's a bit surreal for me because being able to, I've been now to Mission Control 4 times and overlooking the nerve center of this mission. So every aspect of this space flight is being monitored by multiple stations throughout Mission Control. And if anybody has seen the old movies like Houston, those Houston Mission Controls, it's just like that, except a lot more modern. And now they're even bumping up the number of stations for say, for example, science. So you had asked, what is NASA trying to do? Not only are they trying to learn about how to operate a rocket to the moon and back, but they're also learning more about the lunar surface. So when it comes time to land, when it comes time to put outposts on there, when it comes time to expand beyond the moon, they're learning the necessary science that's critical, right, to keep this program going. Because without the science and without the understanding, we're setting ourselves up for failure. So this mission is, again, twofold. You have to make sure that technology is working, the operations are going, but you have to understand and set the foundation for the science that's going to continue throughout this program.
What kind of experience have you had there while you've been watching this unfold?
Well, I think one of the most spectacular experiences is being in Mission Control during this mission and actually seeing the full screen with all the operation parameters. And I was there watching the Capcom, who are the people communicating directly with the astronauts, the flight director. Now, the astronauts were asleep for most of the time, but at the very end, when they started to wake up, they played Jim Lovell's beautiful message to them, congratulating them for this space flight. And of course, Lovell has passed away. He passed away last year, so it was pre-recorded. So it was pretty bittersweet because Jim Lovell was the commander of the Apollo 13, whose record was broken on this mission. The record meaning the longest distance from Earth. And so that was a very incredible feat to have done for this mission. And I think the other fantastic experience I had was sitting in the Orion simulator. So they have a full-size mock-up of the simulator, of the spacecraft. And what it does is it does everything the spacecraft does, and it mirrors it. In fact, if they have to test something out on the spacecraft, they'll often do it there. Well, maybe the crew's asleep, and they'll test things out, and then they'll send them these procedures. So being able to sit in that chair, I was in the commander's seat, had control, full manual control, and I am able to shift around, and I was steering the moon in the middle, to the middle of the window that I had. It was fantastic. I've been in simulators before, but nothing like this. This was definitely out of the world.
I'm speaking with Dan Linehan. He's a science writer for the Naval Postgraduate School. Dan, let's bring this back to NPS because 2 of the 4 members of this crew are NPS alumni with military backgrounds. How does that combination of operational experience and advanced education prepare astronauts for a mission like this, where you mentioned they've trained for years and years, but actually being in space is something completely different?
Yeah, I think that combination of education and operational experience that we offer at NPS is vital. We prepare these officers for missions that are like this. And so what I mean is Reed and Victor are both former naval aviators. They are both former test pilots. And so when they are working in a situation like this capsule moving across space, things can go wrong. And when they go wrong, they need to be able to have that mindset of, hey, I've been here before. I've been in situations where if something goes wrong, it's life or death. And that's a really important thing. And also, being that it's a new system, they're used to pushing the envelopes of a system, knowing what they need to know, or following the different procedures in order to kind of really understand how this thing operates. So the next person who comes in is now standing kind of on the shoulders of giants type. So they've kind of done as much as they can. And so I think the education and their service as, again, test pilots and naval aviators are crucial for that. Then you come into the knowledge part of it. When you come to NPS, you're getting an advanced degree. Some people get it in space systems operations. Some get it in mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering. There's all these facets, which then you can use these skill sets and this training that we have to help complete the mission, to help make sure the mission that's laid out in NASA is understood and executed. And that education is just vital to that.
It's not just training the astronauts, although I think the tally is 44 former astronauts have been through the Naval Postgraduate School, but you're also involved in the science. Tell us about how else NPS gets involved with the NASA programs.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the science, we've been participating in the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is also going around the moon at this particular time. And we had our faculty and students work out systems that helped make the maneuvering of that satellite more efficient, and it could save basically more fuel. Now, a satellite, for example, has a limited amount of fuel, and that fuel is needed to move it. And once you run out, the satellite doesn't move, and you can't image things, you can't turn it. Even the International Space Station, once it runs out of fuel, right, it can't maneuver, and it needs to maneuver. So we help figure out ways, for example, on how to help extend the life of a satellite, because it's very expensive and difficult to get to space. So that's, for example, one of our programs. And what happened for this mission is when Integrity spacecraft came at its closest approach, we had NASA had the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter try to image it. And so that data is still being transmitted and analyzed. So hopefully we'll see that soon and see maybe some great pictures taken from one, robotic spacecraft to a live spacecraft.
And how will you bring the learning from this mission back into the NPS curriculum?
Yeah, so I think what happens is there's multiple things here. So as spacecraft systems are being developed for longer duration, we are hoping that we will have the students who are going to be helping to maybe man the flight controls, maybe engineer new systems that are going to be needed for sustaining life on the moon for longer durations. There is a multitude of things that this mission is going to uncover and require great minds to figure out so we can just keep moving forward.
And what will you be watching there in Houston on this last day of the mission as they return to Earth?
Well, I am so excited by watching the images of that capsule from when it's re-entering Earth's atmosphere, floating down into the ocean, and the Navy coming to recover the astronauts safely and the capsule. And it's amazing because the Navy did the initial training, NASA selected them, and now the Navy is coming back to again finish the mission, bring them back safely. And so I think being here at Houston, where they're eventually going to come back, I think that's just really a wonderful thing for me to be kind of, this close observer, although I'm kind of far away in a way, but I also feel like I'm kind of in the mix somewhat, reporting on this. So I think for me, that's going to be, a really special moment.
I've been speaking with Dan Linehan. He's a science writer working for the Naval Postgraduate School. Dan, I really appreciate you bringing us your on-the-ground perspective today.
Oh, Terry, again, thank you very much for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, how broader economic shifts are changing the retirement decisions federal employees now manage on their own. But first, the Washington, D.C. metro region continues to stand out for regional job losses, and new Brookings data shows the recovery still hasn't materialized. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. New data from Brookings shows the greater Washington, D.C. region is still losing ground on jobs, raising questions about how economic systems tied to federal work are adapting or failing to over time. The region is responding strategically, but so far those responses haven't translated into measurable improvement. Here to explain what's happening beneath the surface is Tracy Lowe, fellow at the Brookings Institution. Tracy, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here, Terry.
About 6 months ago, we checked in with Brookings when you first rolled out the DMV monitor and were trying to capture the changes in the workforce that we're following through from the Trump administration's early actions. Now, as I said, we're 6 months out. You've posted an update. What are the biggest changes that you're seeing kind of at the high level? And then we'll dig in.
Well, the biggest change that we've seen is that in 2025, the DMV metro area, right, the area in Maryland and Virginia surrounding the District of Columbia, that region lost more jobs in 2025 than any other major metro area in the entire United States.
Wow. That's a pretty big change. Not just a percentage share, but actually more jobs by count.
Yeah, it was also the biggest percentage share, but it's also the biggest job loss in absolute terms.
Let's start to break some of that down then, because we talk and our listeners are used to hearing us talk about job losses from federal government actions, but this was bigger than that. So kind of walk us through the pieces of the labor market and what you saw.
Sure. The vast majority of the job loss that occurred in the DMV in 2025 was federal. I think something like 95%. The federal government is the nation's largest employer. And so the federal government shedding workers caused job loss in a lot of metro areas nationwide. The DMV was disproportionately impacted, because it is higher exposure. And then also, these policies weren't applied uniformly, right? This isn't like sequestration. So the federal job loss was particularly steep here. But something else different that happened in the DMV that didn't happen anywhere else is that we also lost private sector jobs. Private sector work nationwide the growth is slowing, but it's still positive, or at least it was in 2025. But here in our region, we also lost private sector jobs.
One of the assumptions I think that the administration had, or at least that they said, was these displaced federal employees could switch to higher productivity jobs in the private sector. What you're saying maybe is that didn't happen.
Yeah, so you're quoting the famous fork in the road email that was sent to federal workers. And, at least what we're seeing in the DMV is that actually it, impacts to the private sector in terms of job growth slowing, that began even before the end of the federal fiscal year when the deferred resignations of the fork took effect. We saw private sector job growth. It was still positive, but the rate of growth plateaued over the summer of 2025 and then became negative by the end of the year.
Was that a function of the Trump administration's reduction in contract work, DOGE activities that they were drawing down early on?
So, we can't be 100% sure, but it does seem very likely because the sectors within the DMV that are shedding jobs the main sector that's losing jobs is professional services. And so that's where you'd expect to see a lot of contractors, in that sector category. There are some sectors of the economy that are adding jobs. So I think that the question of this idea of transitioning, from federal work to the private sector is that, well, the private sectors, the categories that are adding jobs are construction, healthcare, leisure and hospitality, and state and local government. And so I do think there's been some transition into state and local government, but that growth it's something like 5,000 jobs. It's not nearly enough to absorb the over 50,000 federal jobs lost in the DMV last year.
Talk to me a little bit about how the timing of that fork in the road policy played out in the numbers that you saw. You might have expected a gradual decrease, and this became a little bit more like a step function, didn't it?
Yeah, well, the issue all along was that nobody knew how many people were going to voluntarily opt into the deferred resignation program, right? The administration itself was kind of disclosing kind of bits and pieces of that, but there hasn't been a ton of comprehensive accounting. And so we had to wait until the end of the federal fiscal year in order to see the choices and experiences of those workers reflected in the Bureau of Labor Statistics unemployment data. Because even if they opted into the deferred resignation program over the summer, they still got paid through the end of the federal fiscal year. And so they don't count as unemployed until October.
And so when did those numbers start to show up in the data?
So we can now see them in the November unemployment data. And so what we did is just analyze through the end of calendar year 2025 in order to see those impacts. And so what we see is that what we saw in terms of unemployment was rising earlier in the year, and part of that was contractor job loss. And now we see the full scale of what happened with the deferred resignation program. And that's a huge surge in unemployment, especially among Black workers and among women workers.
I'm speaking with Tracy Lowe. She's a fellow at Brookings Metro. Tracy, I want to ask you to dive into those two features you just talked about, the differences across ethnicities, demographics, genders. What did you see play out here?
So we see the same pattern that's actually happening nationwide. Unemployment is up a bit everywhere in the country, just a bit, but it's up almost twice as much for Black workers. And so we see that kind of the same proportional increase happening here in the DMV. Unemployment is up almost a whole point for white workers in the DMV, but it's up over 2 percentage points for Black workers. And that is a huge increase in a single year and is, really concerning because it may make inequality work worse. And then also because the region, residentially speaking, is somewhat racially segregated, that means that the fiscal impacts of this job loss will be disproportionately felt by some jurisdictions more than others, even though it's one labor market.
And the impact on women?
So, similar concern here that, anything that affects, women's labor market participation, it actually weakens the economy because women are half the workforce and have a lot of skills. And so, losing their productive engagement in the workforce will have a negative net impact on GDP.
And so when you think about the intersection of those two sets, the Black workforce and the female workforce, Black women have been even more disproportionately affected from the federal job market losses.
Yeah, I think that's the logical conclusion of what we see in the unemployment data.
And the other thing that I think your analysis pulls out is it is not just the U.S. areas around D.C. that are impacted by this, but it reaches more broadly into the Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia area, right?
That's right. In fact, while we did see the biggest increase in unemployment is for residents of the District of Columbia themselves, we also saw really high increases in unemployment in Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and Charles County in Maryland. And when you look at what's happening in terms of trends with private sector job growth, that's an area where, Northern Virginia has been, in large, with the exception of Prince William County, has been largely impacted in very much the same way as the Maryland counties.
So, Tracy, the local government leaders have had a chance to absorb this kind of information and knew the direction of the trend even before they saw perhaps the particulars. Are you seeing evidence that local policy responses are beginning to align with what this data is telling you? Are there new programs, new trends, new directions that local governments are moving in?
Yes. So the region came together through the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments to create a new career platform called talentcapital.ai. It's a website that has a job board, but it's so much more than that. It will also help with resume translation, with skills matching between occupations. It is a really powerful tool for if you are a mid-career worker, for example, who already has a lot of skills and experience. It's a really powerful tool to help translate those skills and experiences potentially to other sectors. Because the federal government has always had a really specific, vocabulary with lots of acronyms and a really specific way of doing hiring and pathways. And so, people who have been in that ecosystem for a long time have a big cultural competency challenge in retranslating their skills and experience to other sectors that use a different vocabulary and way of doing business. And so it's great to see that tool become available to workers in this region.
Tracy, as you continue this analysis, are there lessons that can be learned from the DMV region's experience and response to this disruption in the labor market that might be applicable to other areas of the country?
I actually think it's the other way around. I think what's happening is that right now it's time for the DMV to learn from major labor market disruptions that have happened. Many other regions in the country have been through labor market disruptions like this before. We know from that experience how serious and painful and hard this is. There's no region that can absorb a labor market shock of this size without negative impacts. And so we need to look to the lessons of those regions in order to understand how to manage the disruption and grow out the other side.
Which examples would you offer?
So I think the classic one that everyone thinks of is the Great Lakes and the big disruption of, what's happened with auto manufacturing or even manufacturing in the bigger picture. That caused a huge shock there that is frankly far beyond what the DMV is going through right now. But if you look, for example, think of Pittsburgh, right? And how the disruption of the steel industry caused a big economic transformation in Pittsburgh. But the city has reinvented itself as an eds and meds economy and is now growing again.
So there's hope.
There's always hope. And really with the DMV, This is a big shock, but the other thing I learned from the DMV monitor and this comparative research approach is that the DMV's fundamentals, economically speaking, from an investment perspective, remain very strong. Still relatively low unemployment, very low crime, better credit. This is a incredibly highly educated workforce. This is a region that has a lot going for it. But in order, for example, to attract new employers, there are some fundamentals that would need to be addressed, like, for example, the very high cost of housing.
I've been speaking with Tracy Lowe. She's a fellow at Brookings Metro. Tracy, thanks so much for walking us through the latest update of the DMV tracker.
Terry, thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, health coverage decisions in retirement can shape when and how federal retirees tap their money. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Once federal employees leave service, decisions about FEHB and Medicare quickly intersect with how they draw income from the TSP. Those choices are easier to manage when they're coordinated rather than made in isolation. Joining us to connect the dots is federal retirement expert Tammy Flanagan, principal at Retire Federal. Tammy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry. It's good to be back, and I look forward to talking to you today.
Well, I want to start by picking your brain on health insurance. Many federal retirees and near retirees are traveling more, and often they're traveling internationally. If you're covered under the Federal Employees Health Benefit Plan, how does that coverage work outside the U.S.?
That's a good question, Terry, because each plan has its own set of requirements when you're traveling overseas. Some plans are fairly generous. In fact, Blue Cross Blue Shield has offices overseas where if you're in those areas where those offices are located, they'll pay the claim for you and take care of it just as if you were here in the U.S. But other plans will say, go ahead, but be prepared to pay out of pocket. And then when you come home, file the claim and we will reimburse you. And in many cases, that also requires that you translate those bills into English and convert the currency into dollars. So you want to check your plan brochure or give your plan carrier a call before you travel overseas just to find out what happens if I have an emergency. What happens if I fall or get sick? What is going to happen as far as paying the bills and getting care? And also importantly is if you can't travel back home commercially like you got over there, you might need some repatriation benefits. And I'll tell you, none of our federal health plans offer those benefits, including TRICARE does not offer it as well. So you want to have some good travel insurance that includes that repatriation benefit. Otherwise, you might be stuck there for 6 months while you recover.
Travel often goes hand in hand with retirement itself. So if someone is just retired from federal service and maybe delayed Medicare, can you walk us through the 8-month special enrollment period for Medicare Part B and what happens if you miss it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, because I think this is becoming a big issue based on the number of emails I've received over the last year with all these massive number of employees who retired. And some of them are over age 65, so they weren't able or didn't have to enroll in Part B while they were still employed, even though they were eligible. Most of them would have enrolled in Part A, which is the hospital insurance, but they delayed enrollment in Part B because they still had current employment health coverage, which means they're not going to be charged a late enrollment penalty as long as they enroll within the special enrollment period that lasts for 8 months following their retirement month. So that gives them time to decide, do I want Part B? Do I need to have Part B? Which health plan is going to work best with it? So it does give you a little bit of time, but you do want to consider it during that period because then from that point forward, for every 12 months past your retirement date, you're going to pay a 10% permanent late enrollment penalty on that standard premium. So if you wait 2 or 3 years to make that decision, that could increase your cost in today's dollars by more than $60 a month just for waiting. So you do want to look into that and consider the benefits of having Medicare versus just using your federal health insurance. We're lucky that we can have that choice where we don't have to take Medicare, but you don't want to be short-sighted about making that decision.
Well, then for retirees who might be juggling FEHB and Medicare and now living on retirement income, how can they think best about aligning those health coverage decisions with what they're doing financially?
Right. Yeah. So, a lot of our employees have 3 sources of income. In fact, most of them do, but it depends on whether they're ready to turn them all on or not. So generally what happens when you first retire, you're going to get your FERS retirement benefit, or in some cases, you're still getting a civil service retirement benefit if you're under the old system. But in addition to that, you might be qualified for Social Security, and you need to decide if you're going to turn that on right away. If you're under your full retirement age for Social Security, you have to decide if I'm going to go back to work or not somewhere, because there is an earnings limit of how much you can make in a job or in a career before you have to hand some of that Social Security benefit back. You don't lose that earnings limit till you reach your full retirement age, which is generally close to age 67 for most of our listeners. Now, your third source of income, this is the most flexible source, is your thrift savings plan. And that's really come a long way since the thrift plan started back in 1987. In fact, I was looking at some recent statistics, and I thought it was in billions, but it's actually in trillions. We have over $1 trillion in the TSP. I had to look up how many zeros that is, and that's 12 zeros after the 1. So that's come quite a long way from nothing to this $1 trillion. But the average account balance is not close to $1 trillion. It's more like 220,000, 240,000 for the average federal worker in their TSP account. So you got to keep saving and build that up so that you can create a source of income to add to your FERS benefit and your Social Security.
I'm speaking with Tammy Flanagan. She's a principal with Retired Federal. Well, Tammy, let's look at the TSP a little bit more in detail, because as of January of this year, TSP participants can do Roth in-plan conversions. So for retirees or those close to retirement, what should people understand about moving pre-tax TSP money into a Roth?
Yeah, it sounds pretty enticing to do that, because you're taking money that you'll have to pay taxes on later on when you start to withdraw the money, but you can convert that now to money that you won't have to pay taxes on later, but you got to pay taxes on it now when you make the conversion. So the way it works when you're doing that within the TSP account is, let's say you decide I'm going to convert $100,000 of my TSP from traditional pre-tax TSP to the after-tax Roth account. Well, that's fine. You can move that entire $100,000 into the Roth version, where it's going to grow tax-free from that point forward. However, the $100,000 now becomes taxable income. So when it's time to pay your 2026 taxes, you're going to have an extra $100,000 W-2, or I should say 1099, that's going to come, that you have to pay tax on that with other money, not the money that you transferred, because that's all wrapped up in your Roth now. Then the other problem with the Roth TSP is that right now tax rates are what they are, but when the time comes to withdraw the money, will they be different? Will you be in a lower tax bracket or a higher tax bracket? Will the rules change, requiring some people to pay tax on their Roth distributions? That's been proposed in the past. So when you're making that decision, you're still taking a bit of a chance, not sure what the future holds. So you got to be careful about the tax planning and also what you might expect in the future down the road.
There's a lot of individual considerations there. And one of the things that's really interesting, speaking of how different people think about their TSP, is how people are actually using the plan. Are they taking it as regular allotments or annuities, or are they doing something else with it?
Well, Terry, there are a lot of numbers coming out recently about what people are doing with their TSP accounts after they leave. And it used to be, and it probably still is to some extent, that some people aren't doing anything with it and just letting it continue to grow, or maybe adding to their savings by going into another job. But for those who are taking money out, and last year was a pretty big year for that, with all the deferred resignations and delays in retirement processing. So it was difficult for some people to get by without a paycheck or without a retirement check for those couple of months. So last year we had 700,000 people take out either age-based or hardship transactions. And half of those were age-based, where as employees they were thinking ahead and getting money out of the TSP, perhaps putting it into an IRA. And for the hardship ones, these are employees that have a financial hardship where they're having trouble paying their monthly bills, and so they're taking that money out of their TSP account and paying tax on it, because that's not a loan. That's a transfer out of the thrift. Now, the loan program is also very popular. We have 500,000 TSP loans outstanding, and those total value of those loans are $5 billion. So we do have a lot of folks who are not only contributing to their thrift, but they're also paying back those loans. But the good news there is you pay back yourself and you pay back money at the G fund rate. So it's a pretty good, decent rate of return on that loan program. Now, as far as withdrawals and ongoing payments, you have a lot of folks who are taking out monthly payments from the thrift where they either decide I need $1,000 a month or whatever that amount is. So there's a lot of ongoing monthly payments, but not so many coming out in the form of the TSP annuity option. A lot of folks have not felt that was a good option for them yet. In fact, I saw there's only about 1,200 annuity payments going out every month. So such a very tiny number compared to how many TSP participants we have. But as far as the folks taking monthly withdrawal options, that's a huge number. That's about 900,000 folks doing that as a supplement, most likely to their FERS benefit and their Social Security.
As you describe that, it's clear that the TSP system allows for a lot of flexibility and a lot of individual design. What conclusions do you draw as you look at all of that variation there about how people really want their retirement distributions to work for them?
Yeah, well, I think the whole goal of the TSP was to create that third source of income, because you can't really live quite nicely on your FERS benefit by itself. That's going to pay your health insurance and your other benefits, and what's left isn't all that much to live on. So between that and your Social Security, you're going to need that third stream of income. So be sure that you consider that in your retirement planning, because if you retire at age 57, pretty young age to retire, you have to plan for the next 3 or 4 decades of life, and you want to make sure that amount of money that you've saved is going to last you that long. So don't be too quick to pull too much out too fast. So sometimes it might require a little part-time job or something to supplement your other income while you're waiting till the time is right to make those TSP withdrawals. But it can create a pretty nice source of income. And for some folks, it's a third of their retirement income. In some cases, it's a third coming from FERS, a third of their income coming from Social Security, and another third of it coming from TSP. So they can be equal shares in some cases.
I've been speaking with Tammy Flanagan. She's a principal with Retire Federal. Tammy, thanks as always for your practical advice.
You're welcome. Thanks, Terry. Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Trump administration's Golden Dome missile defense system could receive $17.5 billion in fiscal year 2027. That's after it received a $23 billion down payment last summer. But almost the entire sum hinges on another reconciliation bill. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more detail. Anastasia, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
Talk us through the White House's strategy for funding the Golden Dome in 2027.
Yes, so the base budget request for fiscal 2027 includes approximately $400 million for the Golden Dome, while the remaining $17.1 billion is expected to come from reconciliation funding. This would be the second time this administration relies on reconciliation to fund the Golden Dome. The initiative received $23 billion last summer as a down payment for the system. And the Defense Department has already said that the money has flown and that it will be spent in 2026. As for fiscal 2027, the White House has proposed a $1.5 trillion budget. And to get to that figure, they said that they would use reconciliation again. Since they were successful in passing it last year, the strategy worked so well, they're going to use it again, even though it was positioned in D.C. as a one-and-done effort.
We're hearing a lot of skepticism about whether Congress can get through reconciliation bills for 2027. Does this mean the program actually might be in jeopardy?
Yes, there is a lot more pressure to get another big, beautiful bill done. It's going to be tricky. I think it's not impossible. But As I was told, even though the Golden Dome funding is almost entirely dependent on reconciliation in fiscal 2027, it's wrapped into the base budget for fiscal 2028 and beyond. So the budgets show that the Golden Dome will receive $14.7 billion in fiscal 2028, $15 billion in fiscal 2029, $16 billion in fiscal 2030, and $15.8 billion in fiscal 2031. So maybe the program is a little bit on shaky ground in fiscal 2027. Maybe that's a little risky, but it's on a more stable footing for fiscal 2028 and beyond.
What does the White House say then about how the Golden Dome architecture will come together in its budget documents?
So I'm going to quote how the White House described the initiative in its budget documents. The administration said that the initiative scope is to develop and mature a versatile, multi-layered defense system. The goal is not to create a perfect defense, but to provide an increasingly effective shield that enhances the U.S. capability to deter attacks, disincentivize arms racing, and negotiate from a position of strength. So in these documents, they say the goal is not to create a perfect defense, but when President Donald Trump pitched the Golden Dome to the American people, he said that it would be 100% effective, even though experts said regardless of how much money the administration will pour into this, it just won't work for various reasons. Mainly because of some of the technological challenges for the program are likely, as they call it, insurmountable.
Anastasia, you've been reporting on the challenges facing this program for a while now, whether people think it's actually executable from a technology perspective or from a monetary perspective. Now that the budget documents are out, what are you hearing from experts about this version of the Golden Dome shield?
Yeah, so Trump initially said that the Golden Dome would cost $175 billion. Now that price has gone up by $10 billion already. But multiple analysis estimated that a very limited system could cost between $160 billion to $542 billion. So if the country wants to put the president's vision into reality, it could cost up to $3.6 trillion for this robust all-threat defense. But some experts said that even after pouring trillions of dollars into the system, it would still fail to deliver on the central promise of protecting the United States from nuclear threats. And in terms of reactions that I got about this new vision, Todd Harrison from the American Enterprise Institute said that this is a significant revision from the White House about the Golden Dome's scope and objectives. It seems to walk back what Trump had previously said about the Golden Dome being this impenetrable shield that would forever end the missile threat to the United States. But at the same time, what the program is saying now is much more realistic to achieve within the cost cap of $185 billion that they've been given. And according to the American Enterprise Institute, that would be a very limited system. Gabe Murphy from Taxpayers for Common Sense kind of echoed the same sentiment, saying that from the beginning, the president sold the Golden Dome to taxpayers as this impenetrable shield against all missile threats. But this budget request contradicts that vision and he called it's a fantasy. He said, and I quote, it admits what we've known all along, that no missile defense system can reliably protect the United States from nuclear weapons. He said that Golden Dome is kind of an epitome of taxpayer waste. It's expensive, it's unviable, and strategically counterproductive. And I wanted to mention one more point that he made about the Golden Dome disincentivizing arms racing. Murphy said that building something like the Golden Dome would achieve the opposite. It would actually incentivize our adversaries to build more nuclear weapons to ensure that they can overwhelm our defenses.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks as always.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. Join Federal News Network's CX Exchange on Monday, April 13th to learn how government organizations are unifying services, modernizing delivery, and scaling AI. Visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search CX Exchange to register. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.